Mindhunter, one of Netflix's most chilling crime dramas. The show is set in the late 1970s, when the FBI was still struggling to understand a new type of criminal, the serial killer. It follows two agents, Holden Ford and Bill Tench, as they pioneer techniques in criminal profiling. Their idea was simple but revolutionary. If you want to catch killers, you need to understand how they think. In the series, the agents sit down with some of the most disturbing criminals imaginable, interviewing them face-to-face in prison to study their psychology. What makes Mindhunter so unsettling is that almost all of these interviews are based directly on reality. The characters are inspired by real FBI agents John Douglas and Robert Ressler, who in the 1970s and 80s built the behavioral science unit. They actually conducted interviews with infamous killers like Edmund Kemper, Jerry Brudos, Richard Speck, and Charles Manson. In fact, many of the conversations in the show are nearly word-for-word recreations from the original transcripts. Take Edmund Kemper, for example. Standing at 6'9", known as the co-ed killer, he murdered 10 people, including his own mother. In Mindhunter, his chilling calmness and horrifying detail during interviews are pulled straight from real tapes recorded by the FBI. The work of Douglas and Ressler changed the way criminal investigations were done forever. Profiling became one of the most powerful tools in tracking serial killers, and it's still used today. So while Mindhunter might feel like psychological horror at times, it's one of the most accurate depictions of the FBI's early battle to understand serial murder. Breaking Bad. The series follows Walter White, a mild-mannered high school chemistry teacher in Albuquerque, New Mexico. When he's diagnosed with terminal lung cancer, Walter makes a desperate choice. To provide for his family after his death, he teams up with a former student, Jesse Pinkman, and begins cooking methamphetamine. Over time, Walter transforms into his alter ego, Heisenberg, a cold, calculating drug lord who builds a meth empire and becomes one of the most feared figures in the criminal underworld. That story feels larger than life. But here's the twist. There was actually a real Walter White. In the early 2000s, in Alabama, a man with that very name was caught running a meth operation of his own. This Walter White wasn't a chemistry teacher. He was a career criminal who got deep into the meth trade. He ran a large-scale cooking and distribution network out of his home state, making thousands of dollars per week while also raising a family. He was married, had kids, and was seen by many in his community as just another working man. But behind closed doors, he was building his own underground empire. Eventually, his operation attracted the attention of law enforcement. In 2008, he was arrested on multiple charges including trafficking methamphetamine. According to police, he was producing pounds of high-quality meth and moving it across county lines. He ended up serving years in prison, and his case made headlines nationwide, not just because of the crime, but because his name was literally Walter White. Here was a real man, with the exact same name as Breaking Bad's anti-hero. Of course, his empire was nowhere near the scale of the fictional version. There were no desert standoffs or cartel shootouts, but the parallels were uncanny. So, when people say Breaking Bad felt incredibly real, maybe that's because in some places, it actually was. Now let's talk about Dexter, one of television's most unique takes on crime. The show follows Dexter Morgan, a Miami blood spatter analyst who hides a deadly secret. By day, he works for the police department. By night, he's a vigilante serial killer hunting down murderers, rapists, and criminals who slip through the cracks of the justice system. His code keeps him from killing the innocent, and that moral twist is what made Dexter such a fascinating anti-hero. But the idea of a killer who targets other criminals isn't just fiction. In Brazil, there was a real man nicknamed the Brazilian Dexter. His name was Pedro Rodrigues Filho, and his story is both terrifying and unbelievable. Pedro grew up in a violent household and committed his first murder at just 14. Over the years, he developed his own brutal sense of justice. He sought out drug dealers, thieves, and abusive criminals, killing them without remorse. It's estimated that Pedro murdered over 70 people, many of them while he was already behind bars. He claimed he was cleansing the world of those who didn't deserve to live, echoing Dexter's twisted code. Unlike the fictional character, though, Pedro wasn't meticulous or controlled. He was chaotic, unpredictable, and openly bragged about his crimes. He became a cult figure in Brazil, with some people bizarrely admiring him as a vigilante, even though his actions were nothing short of horrifying. So while Dexter gave us a stylized, almost sympathetic view of the killer with a code, the real-life version shows just how terrifying that concept becomes outside of television.
Plata o plomo.
Now let's move on to Narcos, Netflix's gripping retelling of the rise and fall of Pablo Escobar and the Medellin cartel. His show dramatizes Escobar's empire, one built on cocaine, violence, and unimaginable wealth. At his peak in the 1980s, Escobar was making so much money that he reportedly earned over $70 million a day. He smuggled cocaine into the United States by the ton, built entire networks of airstrips and smuggling routes, and even had politicians and police officers on his payroll. But the real Pablo Escobar was even more unbelievable than what we see on screen. He owned a sprawling estate called Hacienda Nápoles, complete with a private zoo that included exotic animals like elephants and hippos. After his death, those hippos multiplied and still roam the Colombian countryside today. Escobar's brutality was also legendary. He ordered bombings, assassinations, and massacres to protect his empire. He was responsible for thousands of deaths, including judges, politicians, journalists, and innocent civilians caught in the crossfire. His influence was so powerful that at one point, Forbes ranked him among the richest men in the world. Ultimately, Escobar was hunted down by Colombian forces with U.S. assistance, and he was killed in 1993. But his legacy lives on, not only in history books, but in the cultural supernatural fascination that inspired Narcos. The series captures much of his story, but reality was darker, stranger, and more destructive than television could ever fully show. Next up is Ozark, Netflix's dark and suspenseful series about a seemingly ordinary suburban family pulled into the criminal underworld. The story centers on Marty Bird, a financial advisor who is forced to launder money for a violent Mexican drug cartel. To protect his wife and children, he relocates his family to the Lake of the Ozarks in Missouri, where he builds a complicated network of shell companies, casinos, and front businesses to wash millions of dollars in illegal cash. What makes Ozark so gripping is how it takes something we think of as boring accounting and turns it into life-or-death drama. But here's the fascinating part. The money laundering methods shown in the series are based on real cases. One real-world parallel is Kenneth Ryjock, a lawyer and former banking insider who turned to laundering millions for drug traffickers. He created shell corporations, fake accounts, and phony transactions that looked legitimate on paper but were actually cleaning cartel money. Eventually, he was caught and ended up working as a consultant, teaching authorities how laundering really works. Other cases mirror Marty Bird as well. Ordinary professionals who got pulled into laundering because of greed or coercion, only to realize they were in way over their heads. So while Ozark exaggerates for dramatic effect, the schemes it portrays, hiding money in businesses, casinos, and offshore accounts, are all grounded in reality. The show's financial crimes aren't just fiction, they reflect real tactics used by criminals worldwide.
Listen, I'll save you some gas. I'm just going down to the stationery store, then I'll be right back. You don't gotta follow me like yesterday.
Now let's jump across the Atlantic to New Jersey, home of The Sopranos, a show often called the greatest television series ever made. It follows Tony Soprano, a mob boss trying to balance two worlds, running a violent criminal organization while also being a husband and father in the suburbs. The genius of the show was how it humanized a mobster. You'd see Tony at a family barbecue one moment and ordering a hit the next. That contrast between home life and mob life made the series groundbreaking. But here's the twist. Tony Soprano wasn't just a character. He had a real-life counterpart named Vincent Palermo, aka Vinny Ocean, a New Jersey mob boss whose life mirrored Tony's almost exactly. Locals described him as both a neighborhood guy and a dangerous mobster, two sides of the same coin. Incredibly, Palermo even ended up in therapy, just like Tony. But where their stories diverge is the ending. Facing charges in the late 1990s, Palermo flipped and became a government informant. His testimony helped bring down parts of the crime family, and he later entered witness protection. So when fans say Tony Soprano felt real, that's because he was. His double life was inspired by a man who walked the same line between domestic life and organized crime. Finally, let's talk about Snowfall, a gripping series set during one of the darkest periods in modern American history, the 1980s crack cocaine epidemic in Los Angeles. The show follows Franklin Saint, a young and ambitious drug dealer who rises from small-time hustler to a major player in the cocaine trade. While it's dramatized, Franklin's story reflects real events that shook communities across the country. The real-life backdrop is even more shocking. During the 1980s, crack cocaine devastated Los Angeles neighborhoods, creating waves of addiction, violence, and incarceration. Investigations later suggested that the CIA may have indirectly contributed to the crisis by turning a blind eye, or worse, while cocaine was trafficked into the U.S. to fund operations in Central America. This connection between government policy, international drug trade, and street-level dealers is what makes Snowfall feel so intense and real. Characters like Franklin mirror the lives of countless young men who were drawn into the drug business, often as a means of survival or ambition. The series also shows the human cost families torn apart, neighborhoods under siege, and the moral compromises people made just to survive. It's a story about power, greed, and the consequences of systemic corruption, making it one of the most historically grounded and thought-provoking crime dramas in recent years.